back to the channel. My name is Jacob, and today we're going to be talking about arrays. So I feel like now every time I introduce a new concept, I want to go back to our previous concepts to take this new concept through them and see how they connect. So our first concept was declaring variables. So let's start right away here. So we're going to be declaring arrays. So how do you declare an array? You just say const and then give it a name equals square braces. So this is how you instantiate a brand new empty array. So this is like an empty box. We're gonna fill it up with stuff later on. So that was our first video. Our second video was on types. So what type is an array? So I'm just gonna do console.log here. And we are going to use the keyword type of, and we're just going to say R, which is our array over there. And as you can see here from my fancy JavaScript REPL, it's printing for us that the array is of type object. Now, what does that mean? A type object it's not primitive to JavaScript. That means it's not really its own type. It's more of a mix of other types. And you'll see what I mean later on, but essentially you can think of it as a big box, a shelf, or some kind of book that you put the primitive types into. So in our array, we can fill it up with strings. We can say like, A, B, C, right? We can also do stuff like this. We can just throw in a 0 in there. 0 is not a string, it's a number. And we can throw in anything there. We can throw in a true. We can throw in another empty array in there and have that have 1, 2, 3. So as you can see, this is totally valid. It's not giving us any errors, and you can put anything you want inside of arrays. Not that you would want to. So let's go back here. Remove all this. So we have a empty array. We know that it's an object. Object meaning that it is a free form. It's like a box that we can fill with other stuff. Now, we talked in the third video about the truthiness and falsiness of JavaScript's objects. So, what is the truthiness of an array? Well, if we did something like if, and then R, and then we just did here console.log, let's just say array, right? You can see that it is printing an array here. It's printing this it's printing the string array here. It's through our console log because this if conditional has been met. So if you pass in just the array itself, right? If you pass in any object actually, whether it's an array or an object, like a JavaScript object notation, or like a new class, any of the objects that you pass in here will be true. It'll convert them to true. So if we pass in an empty array like that, as you can see, it's still printing this because it considers an array to be true. And why does it do that? Well, an array technically is true because it is an object itself. And just because it's empty does not mean that it'll always be empty, which is kind of weird to think about because strings don't work like that. You can have an empty string, but an empty string will not be filled up because that empty string cannot change. Well, it can. You can re-declare that variable to another full string, but the empty string itself will never change. Like you can't add to an empty string because if you do, it's not an empty string anymore. But you can add to the same array and it'll completely change that array. So that's the difference between strings and arrays. In this case, a string is immutable, meaning you can make a new string and save it in the same variable, but you cannot alter that existing string. Whereas arrays are just boxes for items. So you can always put more stuff into that box and it'll still be saved in the same array. You don't have to redeclare the variable. And I'll show you guys what I mean by that. It's very important to get this point. So the array is true. Now, what if we had an array like AR, and we wanted to check if it was empty? So what if we just did equals equals empty array? Well, as you can see here, it's not printing. And that's because arrays don't equal each other. The compiler is seeing these as two different objects, because if I add something to this one, if I add a number 1 here, right, this one doesn't have to be added with a number 1. So, and then I can add this with a number 2, right? So clearly here you can see that these two are different because this has a 1 and this has a 2. But even if these were both 2, you can still see that there's nothing going on here. There's no console log. And that's because this array and this one are two different arrays. In the memory, they're stored in two different places. So it knows to tell us that these are not equal. So how do we check the truthiness of an array for length, for if it's empty or not? We're gonna say ar.length, right? So let's say we only wanna make sure if the array's length, you can use this keyword length, is greater than 0. So if it has things in it. Well, if that's the case, like this one, now it has the number 2 in it, this will go through because we're checking if the array.length is greater than 0. And this is totally valid to use. It'll never give you any trouble as long as you know that you're working with an array here. Now, if this goes to empty, somebody pops that 2 out, then you see here that we're not consoling anything. So important to remember that we usually check the length of an array to check if it's empty. And there are other ways to do it too. You could convert it to a string, but this is by far the easiest way of checking if the array is empty. Now, that's the truthiness part of an array. Let's remove this so we don't get that error anymore. And let's use that same AR over here, the same variable AR, and we are gonna push stuff into it. So when you want to put something into an array, you can say AR.push, and you can push whatever you want to it. Let's say we push 1. And then now if we do console.log, by the way, you can just print out arrays. You can just say console.log AR, and as you can see here, it prints out for us the square brackets and whatever's inside. So if I push a 1, and then I can say AR.push 2, and now you can see it says 1, 2. To get something out of the array, you can use AR.pop. And what pop does, pop will remove the last item. So if we comment this out, that way this doesn't run anymore, it's commented out. You can see that there's 1, 2, and then there's a 1 and a 2 in the array. If we pop it, you can see that the 2 is popped. So pop always removes the last item. So that's pop. So that's how you get something out. What if you wanted to remove something specific from a specific index? Well, I'll show you guys how to do that. But first, let's say if you wanted to get something from here. Well, we use something called the array index method. So we're gonna say console.log, and let's say you wanted the first item. You type in the name of the array, and then you use square brackets, again, just like how you use for creating the array. And in here, you give the index. Indexes start at 0. So if I do 0 here, it gives me the number 1. And if I say 1, it gives me the number 2. So now let's make this a little bit easier on ourselves. Let's say 0, 1, and then we're gonna say AR.push. Let's push true here. So our array has the string 0, the string 1, and the boolean true. Now, you can see here, if I say, give me array at index 1, it gives me the string of 1. So index 1 is the second item. The second item here being this string of 1. If I say index 0, it gives me the first index. So 0 it always starts at 0, and then it counts upwards from there. So 0 is the first one. Now that's why you get the item 0. And then if I did the 2 gives me the third item right here. So this third item is true. And that's why it's giving me the boolean true here. Now, what if I said give me something that doesn't exist? So give me the array at index 3. Well, index 3 has not been created yet. So it gives us undefined because it's telling us that nothing has been defined at that index yet. You could go in there and define something for that index, but so far it hasn't been defined. So why are we learning all this? What's the point of using arrays? You know, you might think that, okay, they just seem like they just hold objects, but they're not really, they hold items for you, but they don't really do much other than that. Well, actually, that's a big deal in JavaScript and in any programming languages. Arrays are very useful, and the reason is because arrays will collect a group of items that all work in the same way. So in our case here, 0, 1, and true, I mean, there might be a case for something like that, but usually they're in the same type, and that way you can use them in the same way. So 0, 1, and true, that means nothing to you, right? But what if we put in some names? And by the way, to add something, you don't have to use array.push. You can say array of 0 equals, and you can give it whatever you want. Or you can just say at the top here and pass it whatever you want. So we're going to say A, B, and C. So we have A, B, C, and let's say these are group names, okay? Your teacher is going around the classroom and she is picking people randomly to put into groups. And I've seen teachers do this all the time. They'll just pick random students and say, you're in A, you're in B, you're in C, right? So how can we mimic this type of selection? Well, first we need to create an array, because those strings A, B, and C all function the same way. They're all being used to represent group names. You could definitely do this with making 3 constants and saying, you know, const A equals A, const B equals B, and const C equals C. But then you have to remember every single constant that you're using, what they're called, where they are, how you've declared them. And we don't want to run into that, because let's say you have, I don't know, you have 2,000 students for a entrance exam at a university, and they all have different names. You're going to have to remember that many different names and that many different group names. So we don't want to get into that. We want to use an array, put everything into our array, and then have the array tell us what is next. So here's what we're going to do. We have a list of groups, right? So we're going to say this is array. Well, actually, let's call them groups. We can give it a proper name here, English name. That way we know what is going on. Let's remove these 2. So we have groups being here, these 3 groups. And let's say we have const students equals, and let's just give the students some names. So let's say Mary. Oh, what happened there? Okay, Mary, John, and let's say Stephen, Paul, Martha, I don't know, Jen, and David. Just a bunch of students. Okay. Now, if you're the teacher, you have to go put all these people into groups, and we're using a small example here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people into 3 groups. But you might have 40 students, 50 students, 100 students, right? And this list can go on and on. So we have 7 students here. We want to put them into 3 groups. So one way to do it would be to take the index here, divide it by 3, get the remainder, and then pass in that remainder as the group. So let's do this. So we're going to say, and we want to use a loop to go through these. So I'm going to be showing you guys loops very briefly here. I don't want to touch too much on it, just because loops and arrays go hand in hand. So I do have to show you why we use arrays and how we loop through them. And it's just, they sync together perfectly, because an array has a bunch of things in it and a loop goes through each of those things. So it's a strong programming pattern to use loops and arrays together. So here's what I mean. So we're going to say, we're going to use a for loop, and a for loop just goes through all the items in an object, or from some range, let's say from 0 to 20 or whatever range you want. So we're going to say for let student of students. And this is not a typical for loop, this is a for of loop. That's what they call it, for of, because it uses the for keyword and then the of keyword. So we open our brace, and in here we want to, let's just remove this guy, it's giving us undefined. So each student now is being tracked in this keyword student, and each time the loop runs, this is going to run for every time there's a student in student. So it's going to start with Mary, and then it's going to go to John, and then Stephen, Paul, Martha, Jen, and then finally David. So each time that there's a new person, so it keeps on continuing, each time there's another person in the array, it goes to them and it runs whatever code we put in here. So what we're going to do is, let's just console log what group this person's going to be in. We're going to do students dot index of, and this finds us the index, meaning, you know, Mary will be 0, John will be 1, Stephen will be 2, Paul 3, and so on. So we're going to say index of student. Okay, student. And you see here we get the numbers 0 to 6 because there's 7 people. It starts at 0, so we end up with 6. So we're going to say, first we're going to say, we're going to get the index, right? And then we're going to use something called the modulus. And all this fancy percent symbol does is it divides the number. It divides this number by, we're going to say groups dot length. Okay, as you can see here, we're getting 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, 0, dot, 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 and then it goes on forever. And that's because if you take the number 0 divided by 3, you get 0. If you take 1 divided by 3, you get 1. 2 divided by 3, you get 2 as a remainder. So these are all remainders. If you do 3 divided by 3, you get no remainder, and that's why we hit the 0 again. If you do 4 divided by 3, you get 1.33, but the remainder is the 1 here. So we're always looking for the remainder after doing division. So it's very simple to misunderstand what the modulus operator is doing, but just remember that it divides the number and then it just catches the remainder for us. So, and the reason we do this is because now we have all of the indices that are in here. So everybody is mapped. So everybody in students has a distinct indice, and it goes in a kind of fair pattern. It's so 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2. So it's kind of distributed, right? It's like evenly distributed. Not really, but it's pretty close. So now that we have these 0, 1, 2, we're gonna say, first we're gonna say student. We're gonna print the student, and we're gonna use comma, right? So here we're gonna get Mary 0, John 1, Stephen. We're gonna say groups, and then we're gonna close it off right here. So save that, and as you can see here, we're getting Mary is in group A, John is in group B, Stephen is in group C, Paul, group A again, Martha, B, Jen, C, dot, 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 and it goes onwards. So you can see here much more clearly. So it's Mary is in group A, John is a B, Stephen C, and it goes back again. Paul is A, B, C. So this is exactly how a teacher would go down the list. They would start putting people in first group, and then the second group, and then the third group, and then if there's no more groups, it goes back to the beginning. So why is this so powerful, this huge complex line of code? Well, it's actually not that complex. Here we're just printing the student's name, and here we're saying find the group from this array of groups, right? Find the group at index. We use square brackets to denote that we want a specific index, and the index is coming from this piece of code right here. And all this piece of code is doing is it's taking the student, right? So it says it's taking the student here, and it's finding its index inside the student's array. So it's finding this index here, and then it's doing the modulus operator on the length of the groups, right? You can't do it on the length on this one, because then you would get 0, 1, 2 all the way, because these 0 to 6 will give you back 0 to 6. Instead, you want to do it on the array that you want to map to. So we want to map these guys to groups. So we take the groups, we use modulus on the length, right? And this becomes our new index. And now all we had to write was one line, and the for loop does it for us 7 times. And as you can see here, we have we have each student in their correct group. So this is how arrays are used. This is how they can become quite powerful in programming and in implementation of for loops or while loops. And we'll cover more on how to set up a for loop, how they work, the keywords that you use. So I just wanted to give you guys a brief demonstration of how to use an array, because I've seen where a lot of newer programmers will create gigantic complex programs without ever knowing how to use an array. And to be honest, I did this myself. We had to do a game using Java, and I created the game all using single variables. So if I had like 4 things doing the same thing, I would make a new variable for each one, and I would say, const A, const B, const C, const D, and they would each be doing the same exact thing, but keeping track of let's say a different name or a different number. So if I had 4 players, I would just say player 1, 2, 3, player 4, right? And I wouldn't put them all in an array and have a for loop do the code for me. I would copy paste the code. And that is the wrong way of doing code, because you end up copy pasting a lot. You end up running into a lot of errors because maybe you copy wrong, maybe the variable name changes, maybe the value changes, maybe you don't want to use that student anymore in that that person or that object, whatever it is. You don't want to use them in that array anymore. You want to use them for something else, and now everything gets complex. Instead, if you keep everything in arrays, you know that that array is a collection of similar objects that are all going to be used for the same thing. So you can treat everything in there as if it was going to do the same thing, and that keeps your code very clean. Because, for example, if we wanted to use Stephen, Paul, and Martha here, these 3, for something else that's specific to just them, we can create another array with just these 3, and we can make it function in any other way we want. So we can say const, let's see, what do we want to do with Stephen, Paul, and Martha? Let's say that they have part-time jobs. Okay, so part-time jobs equals, we're going to create a new array. We're going to create Stephen, Paul, and Martha. And now we know that this array is keeping track of everybody who has a part-time job. This array is keeping track of all the students that we want to use. And this array is keeping track of all the groups. So you get to differentiate the logic of each group of students or objects. So instead, we could have done this and said, part-time jobs 1 equals Stephen, right? Part-time jobs 2 equals Paul. Part-time jobs 3 equals Martha. But that doesn't come across as nicely. Then you'd have to write part-time jobs everywhere for each of them, and then you'd have to use each of them individually. So I think I've repeated myself enough here. So thank you guys for watching. Really hope that you guys learned something about arrays. Really hope that I could explain how to use an array and the power of the for loop with an array, how we go through each of those items, and how it makes our lives easier by just having to write one statement and having it run on each item in the array. So next time, next video, we'll be covering more objects. So we're going to be covering the JavaScript object notation, which is JSON for short. And we are also going to continue learning more about arrays. In another video, I want to show you guys how we fully utilize for loops and while loops with arrays in a more defined example, something that's more real world, something that's that you might see every day in your code. So guys, thank you for watching. Hope you learned, and check us out on the next one.